Welcome to the Lotcast episode. This is for silent films. My name is Jeffrey, and I'll be hosting a discussion on silent films, their history, and some of our guests' favorite films from the silent era. I'm going to start by introducing everybody real quick. So, our first guest is Elaina.
Hello.
Hello, Elaina. Thanks for joining us. Second guest is Iggy.
Hey,
Hello, Iggy. And then our final guest is Daniel.
Hello.
Welcome, Daniel. All right, thanks for joining, everybody. So I think the first thing that we should talk about for silent films, and we should all get a response from everyone, is why do you like silent films, and how did you get into the silent film world? Let's start with you, Elaina.
So I got into silent films probably about 9 months ago or so. And I did a little bit of a silent film binge. I watched maybe like 20 silent films in the span of a month. And I thought that would be it for a bit. And then I just found myself wanting to come back to them. I think I just really enjoy the experimentation of the silent era and just not it's an era where a lot of people were just experimenting and not exactly knowing what worked. And I just like the variety and the creativity of the era, and it keeps making me want to come back.
Yeah, I totally understand that. What about you, Iggy?
So back when I first started watching movies, the very first silent film I watched was Nosferatu. It was October, and I figured, hey, why not go back to this movie that's 100 years old and see how
Right.
it holds up today? And I actually hated it. So
Oh, perfect.
yeah, not the best introduction personally,
Yeah,
but
that's all right.
throughout the years I've come to like a lot more of these like older movies. So I've continually gone back to the 20s, the 30s, and yeah, I just really like silent films because I'm a big visual, I'm a big fan of visual storytelling, and that's really something you had to nail back then.
100%, definitely.
Yeah, and I just think they're a really good example of what cinema started out as and the potential it had, to carry throughout the rest of, I guess, the century.
Yeah, of course. What about you, Daniel? What's your connection to silent films?
So it's actually funny you mentioned that, Iggy, because my story is actually pretty similar, although it's a different Murnau film. I basically, at the same time I got into movies, I was trying to watch the popular canon. I got a little bit taste of like art house and old cinema. And my first silent was the one that just appeared on all the lists, which was Sunrise. And I didn't like it at all because it's just structurally like so bizarre, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And like I had such a baby cinema taste. I couldn't appreciate all the visuals until much later, and this was several years ago. And then the other silent memory I had was I was in my senior year of undergrad. I was sneaking into just classes. I had a quarter where my last quarter I was really only in a couple classes, and I had a lot of free time, so I was just sneaking into classes that seemed interesting. One was an introduction to American films, and I got to see a bunch of films without the stress of having to do any of the homework, which is nice. So the first couple ones were on the silent era. So I saw Chaplin's The Kid and Buster Keaton's Sherlock Jr., and they didn't really persuade me too much, but I enjoyed them. But it was a fun time. I didn't really love the genre until kind of around the same time as Elaina, actually. It was last October-ish. I saw Faust for, I guess, Spooktober reasons, even though it wasn't particularly scary. But it was just so visually dazzling, and it was kind of the tipping point into just wanting to see more, especially pre-20 silent films, and I'm really glad I did.
Yeah. I find it really interesting that both of you, like your first exposure was something that you didn't like at all. Because for me, I would say like my first major exposure to silent film, well, actually that's a lie. I think my first exposure to silent films was through Soviet Montage, which I don't really think is like the best first exposure to silent films, but I think that like when I really started getting into it, the first one I saw was Passion of Joan of Arc, which I just like completely loved. I was like completely transfixed by it, and there was like no looking back from there. So I find it like really fascinating that you both had like a negative experience first. 'Cause I don't think I ever really had like a negative experience before. So, yeah.
Well, when you're starting out watching movies, it's like going from sound to no sound. It's like a hard pill to swallow, and especially with like most silent movies, they have this continuous soundtrack. I think that's what really annoyed me about Nosferatu, is like the never-ending soundtrack when it was supposedly like
Yeah.
this eerie, tense horror movie, and I think that's the main reason I hated it. But I've yet to revisit it to see if I've proven myself wrong or not.
I think that's a good leeway into something that we should talk about. Is what are some like big misconceptions of silent films, right? And one of them is that they were silent, right? They were not silent, right? They were always accompanied by some musician of some form. It could be a full orchestra, someone on an organ or a piano, or maybe a small string group. It could be up to the theater's discretion. But I always find that pretty interesting when you hear about silent films. You're like, oh, well, you're just supposed to sit there in silence in a big theater and you just watch a movie. Like, that sounds horrible to me.
Yeah, that's what most people think.
Yeah.
But it
Right,
can't be
but-
farther from the truth.
Exactly.
It's kind of a branding issue with silent films, I think, more than anything.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It
I
is.
think that the name silent films definitely hurts that or impacts that perception because
Yes.
yeah, people think that you sit there in silence. It's not silent. The score is like a really big part of it.
Yeah, I'm just thankful to live in this time where we have so many rescorings of old movies, composers who are going back to create like whole new orchestral scores, and for all these classics that either had lost soundtracks or really no composed soundtracks at all. So it's like kind of the best time to watch silent films of any point in history.
Definitely. We're getting some fantastic remasters as well, which has just helped expose the genre to a lot more audiences, which is fantastic.
I was actually doing some reading earlier after I watched Man with a Movie Camera.
Mhm.
Yeah, one of my absolutely favorite scores of all time, like silent or not, and it came out, I think, in the early 2000s. Michael Nyman or
Mhm.
Neiman, he recorded this whole new soundtrack, and I can't imagine a movie without it. So it's super
Yeah.
like
We
I
definitely
don't
take
know.
it for granted. And what's funny is back then, they definitely took it for granted too, right? That when you read old reviews of silent films from the time period or just news about them in general, no one really mentions the music. And when they do, if it's a big event thing, then maybe they'll mention it. But most silence, they don't talk about the music and company. So a lot of it was just kind of blended in and taken for granted, definitely at the time period too.
What is everyone's preferred way of watching a silent movie? I mean, like with the scores and all that. Do you prefer like how it originally, like with an organ back in the day, or do you prefer listening maybe with like a modern day score, or like someone making new music for?
Right. Well, that's
Yeah.
kind of the tricky thing about silent films, right? It was totally up to whatever movie theater you were in. If they had someone who could play the organ that day, you were going to hear organ. But if they didn't, then maybe you'd hear like an automatic piano player or something. It was kind of up to the musician's taste and discretion on what kind of music you'd be getting. There's a couple silent films that did have scores made for them, right? Like Joseph Carl Briel did Birth of Nations score. He had a specific score made for the movie, um, which was not really common back then. That was kind of a new thing. But before that, before like 1916 or so, or I think it was 1918, whatever, um, it was just whoever was available, and they just played stuff that they had around. There were like cue cards and things like that, and that's where it was like a director could give musicians like, hey, here's like a tune that could work, but again, it wasn't enforced, so musicians could take the cue cards or just play whatever they knew over the movies, which I think is fascinating. That there's just kind of like free expression to go along with these films that are also free expression at the time.
Yeah, I think my preference is for orchestral scores primarily, especially these kind of sweeping epic silent films. I feel like you need like a big ensemble to match that.
Mm-hmm.
The one cool thing, so for instance, like the score to The Big Parade, which is maybe one of my favorite silent scores. It's a rescoring though by the famous composer Carl Davis. What he did was he took the motifs of the original score, which I think have been lost, but he used that as the basis for this whole new score. So you still hear kind of like what it would have sounded like on its premiere with the actual accompaniment, but it's all re-envisioned and reinterpreted for, I think, a much grander. And I think, Carl Davis has done so many great silent scores. This one it's so wonderful. The stuff that he was able to do with this and a bunch of other silent films. Napoleon also one of his great scores.
Yes. His score for Napoleon is just astounding. Love that.
I think that often you don't realize how important the score is until you try to watch them without a score as well, which I don't. Maybe that you guys have tried to do that at some point. But there are like a few times where like I just didn't have a score to go with it, and like I just can't sit in complete silence. So I would just like put some like unintrusive piano music on in the background, and it's just not the same. I mean, it like fills the void, but one of my favorite silent films I watched like that, which is The Great White Silence. Like I didn't watch it with the score that went with it, and I still really enjoyed it enough that it's one of my favorites. But the score is like just such an important part of the experience, and you often want something that like matches the intensity of it. But there are definitely times like I would prefer obviously a score that is composed to go with the film. And if it's something kind of understated, maybe something that's like piano or a small ensemble, and if it's this big sweeping epic, to have something that's an orchestral score. And sometimes you don't really get that choice. Sometimes I watch something that might be a little more obscure and there's just not a score that I have that was composed to go with it, and it's just a bunch of classical pieces like collaged together to sort of match the scenes, which I'm sure that you guys have heard as well.
Yes, many times.
And it's fine. It like indicates how you're supposed to feel in that scene, and at least matches the what the film is trying to evoke. But I mean, obviously the preference is very much for a score that was composed for the film and matches its grandiosity or how understated it is or whatever.
Yeah, I've actually had an experience where I watched, this was actually the first episode of Louis Feuillard's Fantomas, just without any music, by myself. And it was not a great experience. I really felt there was kind of a missing component when I watched it. But when I watched it again recently with the music really added this very playful kind of element to the whole story, which is kind of lost. It was kind of a little more turgid and just kind of, it was a lot more serious without any sort of score and just silence. So it really kind of changed my opinion on that one, the first episode at least.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever chosen to watch a movie, a silent film, without its score, but I actually wish I did in one recent case. I was watching movies to research for this episode, and I saw The Passion of Joan of Arc, which I know you love, Elaina. And I wish I had seen that without a score, because I think it really would have made the stark visuals that much more like enchanting. That's a word everyone uses to describe that film, but I was a little underwhelmed with it, and I didn't find myself as engaged, as enchanted as I would have liked. But I think seeing the trial play out with no score, just the words that these jurors are using to damn Joan of Arc to hell.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I think right on the new Criterion release for that movie, there's a couple score. I think there's 2 score options.
I think there are 3.
Are there? Yeah. Okay. So there's a bunch
on Criterion
of
Channel. There are 3. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different interpretations.
Criterion Channel.
Okay, nice. Yeah. So there's a lot of different like versions of a soundtrack. I know there's a wonderful piano one, and then like a full orchestra, and then like an electronic one. So there's a lot of different vibes, I guess you could go with soundtracks.
Yeah, I listened to the full orchestra, and it was just kind of overbearing, I think, personally.
Yeah, I can see that.
My favorite is the choral one. I think it's called Voices of Light.
Yes.
Highly
Yes,
recommend
That's
that one.
great. It's
that's how
great.
I saw it, and it's
Yeah, I probably will give it a rewatch some point because I just feel like there's like this missing piece that with that film that just hasn't clicked for me yet. And I definitely have to revisit it because it's like one of the biggest classics ever.
Yeah, and just to tack on to like some of those points, I know that an instance recently, like where I watched something without the score was Geoff when we were watching Robin Hood, and the score was just like so annoying. It was
I
such
know.
a long film. The score was so
horrible.
annoying. We just turned it off and finished it.
Yeah,
Because sometimes
exactly.
like the score is just, it was so bad and so like grating after 2 hours that we just finished without it. It was awful.
Yeah, it definitely
Yikes.
soured the Robin Hood
But
experience.
yeah, but a lot of the time, sometimes people ask, what is the intended way to watch a certain silent film? And it's really kind of impossible to watch silent films as they were originally intended because we don't have the original scores. You like can't go and watch them as they were watched in, the 1910s or the 1920s. And so you just kind of have to navigate how do you kind of recreate that experience or alter that experience to fit something that you will enjoy, um, and kind of balance that. It's really easy with films that are released now, obviously, to watch them as they were intended. But yeah, the atmosphere of silent films, as in the time that they were made, is something that you kind of can't get anymore because of how many scores have been lost and the theaters that they were shown in. It's just something that you can't really, um, you have to try to replicate as best you can.
Right, and it's something to always, I feel like you have to remember is silents were only around for maybe 30 years or so, which is not a long time. And that's a pretty short window for a genre. And the fact that that spawned movies today is pretty insane to me. That we just, those tiny 30 years started a whole new art form is mind boggling.
Well, those were the first 30, like, those were like the most commercially successful times for the movies, right? Because it was seen more of as like a big event that like you prepare for, you dress up for.
Well, you know what? Let's talk about that. It could be good next discussion. Is uh, so how would someone go experience a silent film, right back then? Because I feel like if you're talking about silent movies, you got to split them up into like three sections. I would say you've got the beginning films, like in the late 1800s, like 1900, where they're like primitive, mostly showing entertainment only kind of content, where they're just there to make a quick buck, show someone laughing or falling down. There you go. And then you've got the narrative movement in between. And then the final third one would be probably the end of the era and the inclusion of sound. So I feel like if you're going to say, let's go watch a silent movie in the 1890s, it's going to be like, and honestly, probably a shithole little circus that is coming into town. And you're stuck in this little room, right, filled with a kinetoscope thing. So, like, the kinetoscope was the very first version of what we could call a movie, right, where it's Thomas Edison and the actual creator, W.K.L. Dixon, right, he came up with the camera, and he also established 35 millimeter as like the format that we still use today, which is also insane that that's still used. It was the first thing that they came up with. So a kinetoscope is like just this tiny little thing you would peek into, and you would watch a short little clip of probably a woman undressing or someone doing something silly, and then there you go. That was it.
You would
So
laugh and move on.
early on, they were not like these big grand things.
Yeah.
They were just little amusements.
It reminded me a lot of the start of photography as well, like which I learned about in an art history class that I took, that photography emerged mostly as a means to distribute pornography. And
Right, exactly.
the start of films is mostly to distribute, pornography and little, like you said, shithole circuses.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that sometimes people forget that, or they think that that era was really stuffy, or, it's just funny to me. I don't think people think about that, you know, the starts of cinema was usually for like, humorous things or
It's literally shits and
pornographic
giggles.
things. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
for, and it was just for like purely, you know, entertainment to make some money.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think Edison, who you mentioned, he was one of the founders of the Motion Picture Patent Company, the MPPC, and something kind of they contributed to this whole perception of film being this just kind of, you know, light entertainment, kind of, you know, not very worthwhile medium. And it was only really until the advent of features where it became more of a something that the middle class was able to get behind. Like, oh, this is actually, you know, some entertainment that we can go to and not, you know, look bad.
Exactly.
But yeah, they thought audiences were stupid and they didn't want. They restricted basically filmmakers to making these just one reelers or, you know, very very short films.
And just from perspective, one reel of film is like maybe 1,000 feet or so. So it's not very long. That's maybe, I mean, most early signs were 15 minutes maximum. Maybe 30 minutes if it's a little adventurous, but pretty short experiences on the whole.
Yeah, you guys know how I feel about short films.
Oh my god.
And why don't you talk about that?
I don't know. Ever since I've started watching movies a bit more seriously, I just kind of have this bias against short films, and I can't control it. I would rather just watch a feature rather than like a handful of short films. I think I personally get my money's worth more that way.
Oh, that's funny.
I have a question, and it's, do you guys think that you get a whole lot out of watching the very early 19th century, you know, one or 2 minute short films?
You mean 20th century?
No.
I haven't seen any of the 19th century, early 19th century ones. But
oh no, I mean the early. Oh my god. I mean early films in the 19th century. Do you guys think that you get anything out of that, or do you think that watching just one is enough to get an idea of what that era was like?
You mean like the train arriving at the station and the workers leaving the factory, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I've seen a couple in my early film class, and I don't know. I've seen enough. Like, obviously, they're important for preservation and the history of film, but I'm not going to go out of my way to YouTube a 30-second short film from 1898.
That's fine. I think I gotta disagree with you there, because at least for me, I think it's an interesting look at what people viewed as entertainment back then. Right, so like there's the Thomas Edison short where you watch an elephant get electrocuted to death, right? And back then that was probably really interesting to see and not horrific as it is now to watch this elephant just die, right? And there's a little drama with that elephant that you can look into. It's insane, but stuff like that I think is important to figure out where movies come from, because it starts out as like such a crapshoot of let's just shoot something and see what happens. So there you go. Enjoy whatever it may be.
Also interesting to me, just like how mundane some of the things that they chose to film are. I mean, like an elephant getting electrocuted is definitely one of the more, I guess, like, I don't want to say it's exciting, but like something that's a little more out of the ordinary to watch on film. But things would just be, you know, people walking around or a train coming or people leaving a building. Those are just like really mundane scenes that you're like, couldn't I just go like watch that in real life? And it might be just like coming to this realization that like people had never seen a picture move before. And that was something that was really unusual in itself. I mean, that's mostly the value I get out of it. I don't think that they're worth like going and binging 100 of them. But it's interesting to see, like, try to put yourself in their shoes and kind of understand how new the medium was.
Yeah, I think you have to remember that aside from the Edison and kinetoscope, we have the Lumiere brothers who developed an even better the cinematograph, basically the first true movie projector, kind of this all-in-one device that could expose film, develop the negative, and project it. But they were originally photographers. Like, they didn't think of cinema as some narrative-telling device. They wanted to just capture reality, and they didn't see a vision for cinema, like kind of unlike Edison, who did. So this was, I guess, why if some of those early Lumiere shorts in particular are kind of just whatever. It's really all that they thought that film was capable of. It's kind of interesting, at least when you look at these early 1900 ones. So you kind of have cinema going in multiple different directions. It's kind of this time of, it's creativity. There's no one really knows how to make movies, and people. You have Georges Méliès, who made these really fantastical stories, but his films kind of didn't win out in the end. The film moved towards a more realistic type of narrative, stuff like Edwin Porter was making. Things like The Great Train Robbery turned out to be a lot more similar to the types of silent movies that were made right after. So yeah, it's this really interesting kind of a fork in the road, or this kind of this point in time where you didn't really know what was coming next. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm glad you brought up Méliès, because I want to point out he's kind of the exception for me. I do like a lot of his early stuff, because he really pushed, like, with his imagination, he pushed things as far as they could go. And a lot of his stuff really still holds up to this day. And it's easy to see why stuff like that would be considered, so revolutionary and so fantastical, because it still kind of is today.
No, I agree.
Yeah, a point about Méliès is he basically kind of pioneered, or he codified like all the different special effects used in film, basically up until CGI. So like he did things like stop motion,
that's insane,
multiple exposure, all these different techniques, things that basically a modern green screen could do without the modern green screen. So like he filmed actors and objects in front of like a black background and used a second exposure to record the background. That's like stuff like that, which pretty insane once you think about it. This is basically how movies are made today, but like,
and he figured it out so early too, which is.
Yeah. I find that with him, like, often narratively, there isn't much there, which, I mean, it's before, film was really being used as a complex narrative tool. But it is really amazing to especially view before even the turn of the 20th century, right? Like, using all these different techniques and a lot of set building and costuming. I think that was definitely one of the really early creative forces in cinema, kind of pushing for it more as an art form, even if I find that sometimes they're a little like nonsensical or fantastical for me today.
That's what makes them good.
Exactly. So that's the thing we can transition to is, when a lot of people think of silent movies, they just think of something in black and white. And that's also really not the case, right? A lot of silent movies were tinted or colored.
That's true.
And that's a huge process that sounds like the worst time-consuming thing in the world. Individually painting each frame to get a certain color out, or simply tinting the entire film itself a certain color, right? Like when a lot of silents, when they go to nighttime, they just tint the whole film blue, so you know that it's nighttime, quote unquote.
Yeah, and I think that's really cute, and I like
that it is very cute.
Yeah. See, getting into silent films, I knew that they were supposed to have a musical score attached to them, but I had no idea that there was any color component to silent films. And I think the first time I saw it, it really kind of amazed me and was really unexpected. I think that a lot of people have had that experience the first time that they watch a silent film and it suddenly is like blue or red. You're like, whoa, I thought that it was black and white. And it's really interesting the ways that they use it. Of course, sometimes it's a very like practical uses and being like, well, they had to, film these things in daylight to have enough light to operate the cameras and everything. So it's hard to show that it's nighttime besides, tinting the film blue. But sometimes I think, especially with like German expressionist works, that it's like a very much like creative choice. And there's like a lot of exciting color tinting things going on. And also like, if you've never seen a like painted silent film with, you know, all sorts of colors painted in a specific spot, it really is kind of a fun experience. Like that one of the dancing and the, what's that one called? And the dress changes colors.
Oh,
It's like
yes.
really kind of
Serpentine
cool to
dances.
watch.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a
yeah.
fantastic example of it. Yeah, I mean, about 1910, most silent films were getting some kind of tinting or toning done. So it was a very common thing to expect after a certain point. The other big invention is the title cards or the inner title cards, right? I think by 1903 or so, they had been pretty much confirmed as a thing to expect in every movie. But something I always think about and kind of laugh at is, right, before we had title cards to explain what someone was saying, you would have people in the theater who would just talk to you about what was going on. I think in the UK they were called barkers. And in Japan they had a different name. I think they went by how do you say it?
Benchy.
Yes, yep. And they would literally just describe the movie as it was going on, and that was like expected and wanted. And I just think it's funny that I just can't picture watching a movie that way.
Yeah, and that's another part of the silent film experience that like you just can't really replicate. And you know, you might watch something and be like, I'm so confused, what is the plot of this? And like have to remember that someone was there explaining it to you. And that you're not really watching it in its originally intended form, if that's the kind of thing that it was meant for.
Right. I think what I do think is interesting is silent films and movies in general is kind of viewed as like a strictly American thing, which it definitely does become American first. But for these early years, it was all France, for the most part, really pushing the limit of the art form. And I think France had the first like really big film companies that you could recognize with Pathé and Gaumont. And those two, they were making movies very consistently all the way up till World War One. I think they had, by 1904, 1903, they had like 2K movies under their belt already released.
Yeah.
So they were really pushing the medium out like crazy. But then
Italy a little bit as well. Some of the early
right, it was mostly Europe
ones too.
really pushing for the medium here. But yeah, then we can talk about World War One era, and that kind of ruins European cinema for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that some of that it comes from the prevalence of like Hollywood and like the, you know, the influence of Hollywood on a global scale later, and like associating kind of all filmmaking with the United States and kind of overlooking the early work that was done in film as a medium in Europe before the United States really jumped in.
Yeah, there's one other thing with the war is these European countries that had to go to war, so cinema, like the chemicals used to produce celluloid were actually the same used to make gunpowder. So that's why these European countries basically stopped making movies around the time of World War One, whereas America was like, we can just keep pumping it out, and they basically, cinema prospered and they got like almost total control of the international market.
Yeah, that's why most movies by the end of World War One were just all American films coming in. It took a long time for Europe to come back to any kind of form, and then World War II hits. So it's just a constant buffer of wars on the film industry in Europe, which is unfortunate.
I don't know when we should jump into Birth of a Nation.
D.W. Griffith time.
Yeah, I think that it's really hard to discuss the American or the emergence of the American film industry without talking about that, especially in the pre-World War One era or at the start of that.
That movie is 12 reels long, 3 hours, massively racist, and so epic and on a scale that had never really been seen before. Now, Griffith definitely had his influences from Italy and France, but he really reached a new height of what could be possible with not only a movie camera, but like movies as a concept with Birth of a Nation. And it is unfortunate that something so vile is so integral to the history of movies because you can't not talk about it. It's too important. It set too many standards. It set too many expectations. I mean, it was the first true big event movie that you could go see. Right? They even changed how much it cost to go see it. It was so big to go experience. Right? Like normally it cost a nickel to see a movie. Well, they charged $2 instead to go see Birth of a Nation. That's how important it was. Cost more money.
Yeah, first movie with an orchestral, like a live orchestra there to perform. So it was like it set the tone
They
immediately.
went on a whole road show across the country, going to big theaters,
That's right,
the whole
yeah.
thing. It was a big deal. And what's funny is we don't actually have the original movie. When it was first shown, Griffith was like, "Well, I could probably cut some scenes down," because he got a lot of complaints. So what we actually have been like, what we have available is like the 1921 re-release of the movie. So we don't necessarily even have the full experience, which I think is a little too bad, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think that watching 1910s films I've said this before in other places, that I feel like they fall into two categories of kind of films that might have some cool effects or like some cool technical skills, but the plots are pretty bare bones. Or films that are just like try to be really over the top and like take on a lot of they're just like incredibly ambitious with the medium. And I think that like Birth of a Nation is like a real example of a really ambitious film that I can understand why it was so successful, because I don't think that it really like falters in any spot. I mean, besides the racism, uh,
Right.
like a lot of
That
these
little
other
thing.
films, they kind of have some like narrative faltering, or they don't quite succeed at everything that they plan out. And you watch Birth of a Nation, or at least for me, I watched Birth of a Nation, and I was like, there's no like narrative stumbles. There are no like, it was just, it flew by incredibly fast. And it's like really unfortunate that it's just like horrible content because of how expertly it's crafted. It's just like paced really great, and um I don't know, it's there's just something about it that you can like understand how important it was when you look at it compared to other films from that era. But of course, like the content, it's really unforgivable, the influence that it had
Yes. Yeah.
on the American nation, because at that point, like the KKK was basically non-existent. Um, and the film basically brought that institution back, which is really awful and horrible, and the influence that it had. And it was incredibly controversial at the time that it was released. It's not even just today that we think it's racist. Like people thought it was racist in 1915.
Which really says
And
something.
so,
Yeah, I should say.
okay,
Yeah, if your film is considered racist in 1915,
it's
Yeah,
bad.
it's not
certainly.
Yeah.
yeah. To pick up on a few of those points, yeah, I think the fluidity and the narrative maturity of Birth of a Nation, it's really unparalleled in
Hmm.
1910 cinema. It's really
Yeah.
just far and away ahead of its time. I think perhaps maybe the best composed movie of its time.
Definitely.
He maybe not the first in a lot of aspects, if you want to dig into some of the Italian epics, but Griffith was the one to synthesize them into something so ambitious. And yeah, and I think with the whole KKK revival, my point is that if the film weren't so powerful and well made, I don't think the KKK at least would have revived to that same extent. It really shows the power of
Exactly.
movies. Too bad just for the wrong reason, but there's
I mean, Birth of a Nation is the reason we have Hollywood, I would say. I mean, it made so much money for all of its distributors and Griffith himself. It was able to fund the Hollywood that we know. Like I think Cecil D. DeMille was one of the distributors, and he made $1 million just on distribution rights alone from that. So he was able to establish modern Hollywood studio system because of this movie and how successful it was.
Yeah. And I think it's really the reason that cinema became something that was taken seriously. Before then, it wasn't really taken that seriously,
Right.
and like the fact that it had such an important influence on the United States is really kind of the reason that it became something that was taken seriously as a medium, which is really kind of unfortunate, but just the way things are, I believe. I'm pretty sure it was the first film shown in the White House and things like
Yeah, it
that. I mean,
was.
it's really this
Yeah.
like ingrained in um, American history for a variety of reasons, for in film history and also just like American history as a whole.
Can I say one good unintended
Of
effect it
course.
had? It's actually spurred African American filmmakers to produce works like that more accurately and fairly depicted
That's right.
Black life
Hey,
in
there you
America.
go. That's something.
So filmmakers like Oscar
Yeah.
Michaud were able to have their voices basically heard, not unfortunately to the same degree, but you know, one of his films, Within Our Gates, I think is always one I'd recommend to see alongside Birth of a Nation to get the opposite
Right.
perspective.
Fun
No.
little racist thing about that. So Within Our Gates,
Fun.
well, so here, so when in the intertitles for that movie, when they show the word Negro, it's always capitalized, and this was a specific choice because back then being called that word was normal and accepted, right? But if you're going to be called that, you might as well capitalize it. So the movie is a great like representation of not only like what relations were like back then, but even like from the black community, how they saw themselves in film and what they were supposed to be representing as. Just like as an example of what that movie is like.
So I just got done watching this movie before we started recording this.
Oh, okay, nice.
Yeah.
Birth of a Nation, right?
No,
Not
yes,
Within Our
yes.
Gates.
Birth of a Nation. And I don't know. Maybe I just have a bias against it because it's so horribly racist, but I can't agree with you guys that it's like that extremely well made. I found it, like Elaina said, the pace, it went by super quick for her. It was the opposite for me. I was just
Right.
like so
Damn.
bored watching this freaking movie.
It did make me look bad.
I think it's honestly just a lot of film stuff that you take for granted now is being
Yes,
established with this
I
movie.
was about to say it was hard to tell like what kind of
Yeah.
techniques the movie was exactly like what's the word? It was inventing, I guess.
Right. Well, I think the biggest thing that Griffith really used well was parallel editing. That was such a big choice for how a movie was made. And parallel editing is when you cut between like two different spaces in the same time frame. So that's something that every single movie now does. And you don't
Yeah.
even think about it because it's so
Yeah,
common, but back
exactly.
then that was brand new.
I didn't even
It
think
was
about it, and like it, I don't know. It was hard to make an impression on me that this was the first movie to do it. So maybe
right.
that's another reason.
Maybe this is an experience that other people didn't have, but even just beyond a technical standpoint and from a narrative standpoint, like there were parts where it's just like a really effective propaganda tool, which I think that is easier for us to see through now because it's something that we don't really, I mean, obviously, hopefully don't sympathize with. But like the first part of it, it's just like really Confederate apologist and like gross in that way and details a lot of the Civil War, but the way that like the characters are painted and like the, you know, atmosphere is created, like it definitely also like prompts this like emotional connection that's not really like common in a lot of those early films. And you can see why it was so effective there because there were parts where I was like I found myself feeling a certain way and then I'd be like, this is really gross that it's like such an effective propaganda
Right.
tool. I mean, I wasn't like falling for it, I mean, because I know I know that it's what it's depicting is like, I mean, obviously it's like horrible, but the way that like just everything is painted, like you can just understand how influential it was from like a narrative and emotional standpoint. Um yeah, I don't know. There's just something about all of that. It's just you can understand, or at least for me, I felt that I could understand its influence when I was seeing it because before I watched it myself, just people are like, oh yeah, it's the racist movie, which yeah, it's the racist movie. But there's just compared to other films of the era, it's like
I guess
I just felt that I needed to like see it myself to kind of understand its influence.
Right.
Yeah, if you're going at it from that emotional perspective, I guess I can kind of understand it. Even though I didn't feel any of those emotions myself.
I'd be curious to hear about what you liked more about Griffith's next feature, aside from the lack
his
of
response.
Since you saw them within close proximity.
Yeah.
I will make one last point about Birth of a Nation, I guess, which is a good segue. The American Film Institute, AFI, ranked this originally in its 1998 top 100 American movies.
1998?
At 44th. In 1998. So as recent as, just, a few years ago. They subsequently, in its 10th year anniversary, they replaced it with Intolerance, his next feature. So I just found that really interesting that this whole reevaluation is even pretty recent.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That people were willing to overlook these very problematic elements of this movie just because of how important it was. So,
and I hope that when I say like things that are, very skilled in its filmmaking, that people don't like interpret that the wrong way. I mean, like the content is really horrible, but I don't really feel like Intolerance. Well, there are some parts of Intolerance that I thought were better than The Birth of a Nation in its, skills and whatever, but for those of you who like don't know, Intolerance is kind of like the follow-up to Birth of a Nation, and it's kind of about how we should all love each other. And hating each other is bad, which is kind of the way that I feel about that. Is like the damage has been done. Like your movie was responsible for bringing back the KKK. I'm sorry that I kind of like don't really buy into this narrative.
Well, that's funny.
That you've been. I don't know.
So actually, that's interesting. After Birth of a Nation, he got huge public backlash, right? And Griffith actually fought against this.
Mm-hmm.
He published a pamphlet, which I'm not joking, is actually called "The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America."
Yes. He went on a crusade.
Published in 1915, basically vilifying censorship, or you could say intolerance. So basically, I think Griffith's Intolerance has been given a misleading kind of context of being an apology for Birth of a Nation. Griffith did not apologize at all. He felt he had nothing to apologize for. And in fact, he said that the critics were the intolerant ones.
This was his response. It's like, fuck you, basically, to all of the people saying,
yeah,
hear you.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense. But it is sort of about, well, I'll just say what I think about it if you need me like a few minutes to talk about it, because I feel like I have a lot to say. Because it's like 4 narratives pieced together, and there's one that's kind of like contemporary to when the film was made, sort of, I think. And then there are 3 that they're very like kind of Christian or biblical in some way, and they're kind of like about these like, struggles between people and how those conflicts lead to their downfall, which I think is kind of, it's a really like bizarre contrast to Birth of a Nation, which basically argues like, is basically like, oh, we're being tolerant of, or I don't even know how to put it. It's basically just like we have to protect like good Southern white women, and it's like, but what, So it's really kind of was bizarre to me that the argument in Intolerance it felt to me like these conflicts are like lead to human downfall, which was really not at all what Birth of a Nation said.
I mean, I watched Intolerance first, so that maybe that's why that wasn't such an issue for me.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was just a really like bizarre take. I suppose you could be like, oh, Griffith never apologized for Birth of a Nation and like double down. It's just really weird, but it is one of those where it takes on a lot more than it can handle. It's like about 3 hours long again, but there are these 4 narratives that are juggled that it's really not paced all that well, and a lot of there's some like really great sets and costuming, especially with like the Babylon setting. But because they put so much work into that set, they really show that plot line way more than any of the other plot lines. And some of the plot lines, I'm just, they should have just been cut. Like, there's really no purpose for them to be there. And the whole thing just felt like a little bit of a jumbled mess to me, even though it's so ambitious in its scale. But I think Geoff said this to me before about like Intolerance was like a flop. It was not successful, and I can kind of understand why, I guess.
It's very challenging.
It confused the hell out of
It confused people. It confused me watching it. There were so many things happening. There's this woman with a cradle. Now we're in Babylon. Now we're in France, and now these people are fighting. And there's like all these like crazy.
And then
there are like 2,000 people in the shot.
France disappears for 20 minutes.
What is? Yeah, that we don't hear about one of the plot lines for half an hour. It's really like, and then it has this like weird message like we should. It's just like really bizarre. I find it really weird that that's the film. Like people were like, "Oh, like Birth of a Nation is a really well crafted film," and then they were like, "Oh, we shouldn't promote this film because it's really racist." And so then they like replace it with Intolerance, and it's like Intolerance is just. I mean, it has a lot of ambition and it really tries to do a lot, but it's just like I understand why people were confused. It's not cohesive to me. I still gave it an 8 out of 10, I think. It just has a lot of the sets and some of the scenes and the battles are really great. But narratively, I was like,
right, again,
like you just like tone it down.
Right, you think of James Cameron's Titanic or like the Avengers, like all these big tentpole movies, right, that are just big and just insane filming,
like
right?
generational events.
Right, this is even more than that. Like the scale of Intolerance is I don't think it's matched by any other movie I've ever seen.
I would agree. I think that that's a big claim, but
it's truly
that really is what
like,
it is.
Like Elaina said, 2,000 extras for like you're just walking down a street scene. Like it's totally unnecessary.
No, but they're all like choreographed dancing too, and like every single inch of the frame, there's different people doing different things, and it's all like it feels like you've literally transported the camera to that time. It's insane.
Yes, it is quite a spectacle.
Yeah, I wanted to point out one other aspect. So I guess from my experience, I was never super confused watching it. I think one thing the movie does really well is its use of tinting, actually. So we talked about it representing like different times of the day, whether you're inside or outside. I think Griffith used it maybe the best I've seen of any silent film, where he used one color for each of his storylines, and in a way such that you're able to kind of unconsciously know when or kind of where you are. And he would use the shot of the cradle like to kind of connect different when he was cutting from one to another. So at least for my money, I think it was about as well told as it could have been, minus, the issue of some narratives being more fleshed out than others. I think there's a big disparity between, say, the modern story, the Babylon story, and the other two.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's the Jesus storyline.
Yeah.
It's so short.
Yeah.
It's barely in the film.
That's the other thing is, even if you know where it's going, sometimes you've already forgotten that plot line. It just hasn't been fleshed out. You just don't remember who the characters are. I think, the sets and the costumes are fleshed out enough that you're like, okay, we're in France now. But it's sometimes you just don't remember what was going on.
Yeah, I would say it's more of a structural issue than a pacing issue. For me, like the 2 hours, 50 minutes, it went by pretty quick. I didn't notice it.
Okay, so let's now that we've kind of talked about like a general overview of early cinema and definitely American cinema, let's talk about some like other smaller movements that were going on during like the late 10s and early 20s. A lot of it not in America. Like we can talk about French Impressionism, which is definitely one of my favorite little moments of cinema. I would say it didn't last very long. It was maybe like 10 years max, if that. But just interesting film choices and creative use of editing and lighting, and all from just a tiny little area of France.
Yeah,
You guys have any favorites from that?
I guess I should start off saying that it's kind of a dubious name a little bit. I think a lot of these filmmakers that kind of fall under this umbrella term don't have a lot of things in common. They do very innovative things, but the techniques and the styles are very different. But yeah, I think in general, their approach to nonlinear editing, their innovative use of lighting, and a lot of them have attempts at portraying like dream sequences and fantasies, other just ingenious methods of telling a story from like different POVs and stuff like that. So yeah, some of my favorite films come, I guess, in this umbrella genre. So I guess one filmmaker in particular, I guess we can get right to him, is Abel Gance. And
yes,
I think he'll come up a bit more in the second part of this podcast. But yeah, two of his films, the only two of his films I've seen, but that I both love are his 1919 war epic J'accuse, or Accuse, and his 1927 biopic of Napoleon, which actually, I guess when I say biopic, I mean part one of what, 6 that never never happened. But it was this huge ambitious project, and he only got to tell the very beginning of his life. So
yes, I love that about Gance, is that even at 90 years old, he was still trying to make it happen. He was trying so hard for that to be a whole picture.
He wanted it so bad.
He really did.
I think he's one of those filmmakers to me that really is one of the ambitious ones that matches up with some of the ambition that maybe Griffith had in the United States. Just because I've only seen IQs, but it's like a really huge production. And some of the shots in it does have like a little bit of like narrative wonkiness that can be expected from some of those like really ambitious 1910s films. It's also like about 3 hours. But some of the shots from it are like just my favorite shots from like all of cinema as a whole. Like it really has some like amazing moments. And it's really kind of like a difficult and emotional watch because it's about World War One and was filmed around World War One. And uses so like soldiers as extras, and I think that's a very like unique thing.
Yeah, it's a very powerful experience watching that movie. I mean, the scene I always think about is like all the crosses.
Yeah.
Just not. I mean, that's so very visceral reaction to that.
Yeah, it comes back to, I guess, I think silent films at their best are visceral experiences. They're ones where the visuals, I mean, you don't need sound to make this sort of visual impression. And I think with Gance in particular in this movie, some of those shots, just using double exposure, the scene with the crosses in particular, there were a bunch of skeletons.
Oh yeah, you didn't like the skeletons. Yes. You thought they were dumb.
You overused them a tad.
I thought they were fun. I'm sorry.
Reminded me of the skeleton dance, Walt Disney's skeleton dance, a little bit later.
Funny.
But
I didn't see that.
It was charming, but yeah.
The shot of the crosses, I mean, I think that's the banner for the film on Letterboxd, which is the entire reason that I watched it. It really is like a brilliant example of visual storytelling where like absolutely no words were needed to explain that. I saw that shot on the Letterboxd banner and I knew that I had to watch it, which just speaks to how powerful it is.
Yeah, I think I have more to say about J'accuse, but
we'll
I would
save it.
Spoilers. We might.
Yeah, we'll save that for the next one.
Yeah, we will be talking about it a little bit more later.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess Geoff and I are the only ones who've seen Napoleon, I think.
Yeah.
And I haven't.
I believe so.
I don't think Iggy.
Yeah, it's a little long.
I don't think I have plans for it in the near future.
You have a 7-hour window to watch.
Yeah.
Iggy, you're telling me you don't have 7 hours for French silent films?
I've already spent my 7 hours of French silent films on Le Vampire.
Oh, there you go.
We didn't even talk about him.
But they fly by for Napoleon, I gotta say. Like, it is a long experience, but it just flies by.
Okay, Geoff, you know me pretty pretty well. Do you think I would like it?
I think so. I mean, the movie is, again, it's on an epic scale like Intolerance, just in a different way. I would say it's not like you've got big battles and uh, things like that, but it's really
Yeah, I
about
was gonna
like
say I would
Napoleon
imagine it
himself.
feels more personal
Um,
since it's not like four stories, but instead like
yeah,
the story of one guy.
I kind of would say it's like the war film
Oh, I love
Patton
Pat.
in some ways, where it is a war movie, but it is very
Yeah.
much
Okay,
about the
that
general
makes
that you're
me
following.
very interested. Let's
Um,
check it out.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend it. I think the only thing the film did, I think towards the end, after the French Revolution segment, basically there's a long segment of Napoleon and I think his wife, and I don't know, some of that dragged on a little bit too long for me. But I mean, aside from that, I think remarkable film. Lots of incredible different camera techniques, stuff that, and
yes.
lots of stuff that he couldn't do because of the limited technology at the time. But
Right.
yeah,
I mean, the movie was so big they had to project it on 3 different screens.
oh yes,
Like it was
That's
insane. Again, how
Definitely
large
one of the
that
more
movie
ambitious
is.
filmmakers of the silent era, for sure.
Yes. I mean, I was saying this I think earlier to you guys. Right. I always put these directors of that time period so far away in time, but Abel Gance lived until the 80s, so he was around for a lot of the current directors that we know and love
did
today.
he
So
like stop making movies or what happened with him?
yes. Well, right, he really wanted to make these big epic movies, right? But no one really wants to fund that after a certain point. And he's also, I get the general vibe from interviews with him that he's kind of a hard ass, and that definitely affects a lot of business decisions in that world. Like if you're not a fun director to work with, it's going to be tough to get people to work for you and put a lot of money up for you. So that
No
definitely
one
didn't
wanted to
help.
watch like 30 hours of Napoleon content.
That's the real reason no one funded him.
Right, unfortunately.
yeah. If there is a sad kind of common theme to all these silent auteurs, I think it's that their fall from being these directors with huge budgets, being able to make movies, a lot of them just fell out because of either the studio system in Hollywood, things
Mhm.
like they gearing towards a more commercialized industry. Their place in filmmaking kind of just got lost and left behind. So this will come up again with other directors that we'll talk about that just kind of unfortunately faded due to reasons like this. Some even for political reasons, which we might get to shortly.
No, right, I mean, like Griffith, right after Intolerance didn't do well, he
Yep.
pretty much left the scene. That was it. He was gone.
Yeah, he made some features, I think, on his own. He had a different production company for some of his later ones, but he was much
Mhm.
more of a smaller love figure at that point in the industry.
Yeah, okay. So we can talk about German Expressionism. Which
That's
is
probably my
it's a fun
favorite
Yeah.
one.
of all the ones.
I think that's a lot of people's favorites.
Yeah, that's probably the most popular one, I would say.
Yeah,
People most
yeah.
recognize that, right? Now
Yeah.
that era
And I
and that
will
little
say,
bit.
I think if people who are not regular silent film watchers, the ones that they have seen usually are either like American slapstick films, like Charlie Chaplin and all of that, or it's like German Expressionist
Hmm.
stuff. So German
Right.
Expressionist is definitely like one of the more popular.
All right. I mean, the Kevin and Caligari,
Yep.
all of Fritzling stuff, Murnau's work. Truly, again, inventive visual choices with the camera and editing.
And
Like,
the sets.
The sets, and they're very like
yes, yeah. I
spooky,
mean,
or most of them are
wonderful.
pretty spooky, I think. And this is like your
Yes.
Nosferatu stuff. Um,
Hmm.
the set design for a lot of German Expressionist films is just like amazing. I think that visually they're some of the best.
Yeah, I guess I just to set the stage a little bit. Uh, we talked about how European countries lagged America in World War One. The German film industry especially lagged other European countries, and they depended on imported films, which were largely anti-German propaganda. So what happened was Germany basically merged all the central production, distribution, and exhibition companies into one singular government-subsidized conglomerate called the UFA, or Universum Film something. And basically they wanted to upgrade German films, and they invested heavily, and they made this whole golden age of German cinema. So that's where you got these creative directors to make, these really extravagant, very artistically, wonderful films. And the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is kind of at the forefront of this whole movement, with how it embodied disturbed, psychological states through decor and makeup.
It really feels like you're inside like a carnival funhouse watching that one, and there's like a lot of interesting color choices, and like it's very much like not naturalistic, I would say, in terms of its like atmosphere.
There's a lot of fantasy. There's a lot of fantasy in this era, in this movement, and it's really quite wonderful because a lot of early silent is so like, here's real life, or like here's a documentary about some people in the snow, or so there's not.
German
it takes a little bit for fantasy to kick in. Yeah, so, like something as big as like Metropolis, right? Like
I think Metropolis is like one of the biggest sets, and just like
I mean that's probably one of the more recognizable silent films. I don't think many people have necessarily seen it, but they definitely know what it is.
They've definitely like seen the poster, and they know the vibe. Yes. And I think that the sets I was gonna say, I think that the sets and like the style of it is a little more like artistically, or I don't want to say that the other ones aren't artistic, but I think that they're more what we think of when we say that they might be like more artistically inclined and not so realistic. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, and even if people haven't seen Metropolis, they've seen everything that has been influenced by Metropolis. There would be no Star Wars or Alien or Blade Runner without Metropolis first.
Yeah, it's such an important movie to sci-fi genre.
Yeah,
it's another one on just like a massive scale.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think for me at least, the dystopic vision of the future where you have this kind of unbridled capitalist society and this whole workers' revolt. It's, I think, one of the most effective uses of science fiction as like social commentary. And even if it's very like on the nose, very, direct, I think it's like a masterpiece and the themes it communicates. So.
I agree with you. Well, so speaking of revolutionary tendencies, let's talk about Soviet montage stuff. It's kind of at the end of the silent era, to be honest. Like Soviet film in general is very strange because the revolution really screws up cinema in Russia for a while, and it takes them a while to get sound even, so they have a long time to just sit there and come up with things on their own. And the Soviet montage films are very I guess intense would be my word for them. They're big movies, even though they're not necessarily long.
They're definitely dense, and I mean it's pretty safe to say that they're basically all like propaganda tools. I mean obviously like a lot of these films are propaganda tools. You could say, Birth of a Nation is a propaganda tool. But I think to us, as like so removed from the early Soviet Union, they're pretty obviously propaganda tools. But there's a lot of like talent and creativity in their creation as well. But they're composed very differently than a lot of other silents, and they're very like collective focused. I don't really know enough to explain the whole like theory behind Montage. I don't know if anyone else knows enough to do that. They kind of hurt my head, but they're very like, again, like visceral experiences.
Well, right, so much of modern editing techniques come from this era, like the very famous Khrushchev effect, right? Where it's the idea that a film sequence is determined by the consequence of juxtaposing like different shots. So you see a picture of a cat, and then the next editing picture you see is a man smiling. So, oh, so he likes seeing the cat. Um, that kind of stuff is where a lot of uh, the whole Russian movement is working on is editing techniques like that.
Yes, that was, as the name of the effect is based off the great teacher, Russian teacher Lev Kuleshov, who had some very famous students you might have heard of, Sergei Eisenstein being one of them. And so, just to talk a little bit about the propaganda, I guess, aspect of this was basically a movement that picked up around the whole revolution, the 1917 revolution, where Bolshevik overthrew the Tsarist government. And Russia was basically this huge, uncontrollable collection of just millions of people. And Lenin thought of a way, or needed a way, to like kind of unify them. And so he was really one of the first to understand film's importance and power as propaganda. And people didn't need like literacy to understand, what you're seeing on screen. They didn't need to know how to read, but anyone could see the images and have, can understand what you're seeing. And basically the mass distribution of film enabled being able to reach so many people. So the film industry got nationalized, and basically that they wanted filmmakers to make pro-Russian films, anti-Tsarist, but things that would show the current government in a positive light, in particular.
I would say like pro-Soviet on the whole. It's not like a specific to Russia thing. I mean, because you have like Dovzhenko working in Ukraine as well, and founding some like film studios that are in modern day Ukraine. And you also like had some I mean, I don't know if they're strictly montage, but like some silent films emerging out of Georgia as well, which were kind of like the other two hubs of filmmaking in the Soviet Union. But yeah, I think that it was really interesting that the government identified so intensely that film would be a really important tool for like disseminating a lot of this like pro-Soviet ideology. And that's why they're just really intense and like collective, and like I don't even know how to explain it besides they're just like about, the masses a lot of the time. And sometimes they like have a focus of like another individual storyline. Like I think that Pudovkin's film Mother is a little more like individually focused versus some of the things that you might see from like Eisenstein. But
Pudovkin, another one of Kuleshov's students. Mm-hmm. So basically, they're the two big students of Kuleshov who made some of the great Russian works. I have not seen any by Pudovkin. I really want to. One other thing, just a connection to make to Griffith. So Intolerance, as we alluded to, bombed at the box office and in America, but not overseas. The Russians, in particular, loved Griffith and Intolerance among his films. Mm-hmm. And what Kuleshov did was he used Intolerance as a way to teach film editing and this whole montage theory. So as Griffith basically was the one to use parallel editing and shortening of shots before the Soviet school, but he basically kind of inspired this whole generation of Soviet filmmakers to make these montage films. And so one little interesting factoid, Kuleshov apparently, as an assignment, he wanted his students to cut Intolerance, the whole film, like as it would, as so if you imagine Intolerance with the gazillion cuts in that film, basically your assignment was you had to recut Intolerance. So yeah, those students knew that film inside and out. And I do think if you want to segue more to Eisenstein in particular, he was perhaps, aside from Griffith, the big pioneer of the silent era. But maybe to contrast the two, Griffith was a lot more intuitive with approaching narrative editing, but Eisenstein was a lot more of a theorist. He had modern theory of editing. He was very intellectual with the way he approached film. And he directed some, I guess, of the key works of silent cinema. I know Elaina, you said was not a huge Eisenstein.
Yeah, he hurts my
fan,
head.
but
He makes my head hurt. I'm sorry. I mean, his stuff is very interesting from like a film history perspective. They're so dense,
Yeah.
so dense, which I think is like made it difficult for me to get into silent films until I saw, Passion of Joan of Arc and some of these other ones. Yeah.
And I also noticed, Iggy, you recently saw Battleship Potemkin. I was just wanted to know some of your thoughts on that film.
That's one of these old silent movies that going into it, I didn't expect to like it that much. But it was actually, I had seen the famous Odessa Steps sequence in film class before, but seeing the whole movie prior to that, seeing what led to it, it actually made the whole sequence that much more effective, which makes me question like modern film teaching. I feel like students aren't really getting the full idea if they don't watch the whole movie.
Right. It's such a big emotional moment, and you need the context of everything beforehand to really get that.
I think going back to the point about like why people enjoy silent films still like 100 years later, and how that they're visceral experiences. I think that people who enjoy Soviet montage, it's like the the most extreme version of like visceral experiences. It's just like the intensity and the energy is really kind of unparalleled in that movement. And so I think if you're looking for like visceral experiences and like really, dense and just like impactful experiences, that might be something to look into.
Yeah, I definitely call Potemkin impactful, if nothing else.
And there are Soviet silent films that are not montage, which I think often get a bit overlooked. I think montage is obviously like the biggest movement, but there are little pockets of Soviet films that resemble what you were seeing out of the United States, in terms of popular films, and I think that's really bizarre to see when your main exposure is montage, because there's such like a contrast there.
Definitely. I mean, all the early Russian films before the revolution are just completely
the pre-revolution films, and then also like the main one that I've seen is Bed and Sofa, which is kind of like a comedy about the plot is like, it's just like a Soviet silent comedy. It's like really not like it's not like montage at all, so it's really bizarre to see when it was made in the 20s, so like after the Soviet Union was founded. And you also have some like kind of like more documentary-ish stuff from what's his name, guy who did
Vertov.
no,
Man with the movie camera.
No, the cranes are flying guy.
Oh, Kalatozov.
Kalatozov. Yeah, Kalatozov. His like really early films that he made in Georgia that are kind of like, I don't think those are really like montage either, but they're kind of just like documentary stuff. So it's interesting to like explore Soviet silence beyond montage, but montage for sure is like the most influential.
Yeah, I guess an accidental segue. I guess I could talk a little bit about Vertov. So one interesting thing I didn't know was his name is actually a pseudonym, which means spinning top. Does anyone know his original name? It's quite funny. His name is Dennis Kaufman.
That's great.
Apparently. Yeah.
That is funny.
He just made up Ziga Vertov, apparently. But yeah, he began as a propagandist photographer and a newsreel editor. So he was very much already learning about how to make propagandist type images and editing, although not from the cinema perspective. But he was basically now kind of conceived as the father of cinema verite, which is this very self-conscious, realistic documentary movement that really, kind of exploded in the 60s and 70s. But he was one of the very first people to do that.
It's just aiming to capture life as it is, right? With like no flourishes.
Yeah, somewhat. Although I'd say he used a lot of flourishes.
Yeah, I was gonna say he's like a great direct line to "I Am Cuba," which is the Kalatozov movie. Those two are like brother and sister films.
I guess I should check that out.
I've not seen
Yeah, I
Cuba,
definitely
so
could see
I
that.
can't comment. But
I guess I should check out I Am Cuba
Oh
then,
my
because
goodness.
it's like the only Kalatozov I've not seen.
It was like one of his big films.
I know.
But yeah, Vertov, he basically denounced conventional narrative film. He called it impotent, and he wanted it to be replaced with like cinema based on organization of camera recorded like documentary material. So, and he made some movies. His big one being Man with a Movie Camera, which is this, you could call it like a portrait of Moscow from dawn to dusk, but it kind of leaves out, there's a lot of self-reflexive elements of that film, which I find really interesting. Something unique to this film in particular. I haven't seen in any other silent films in particular. Even with other city symphony type of films, like Walter Ruttman's Berlin Symphony of a Great City, that feels a lot tamer and a lot less. It doesn't have this element that I think Vertov used quite wonderfully in Man with the Movie Camera.
I think that movie is a new favorite for me. I just watched it today and I was just blown away.
I was just gonna ask, if we're done with the Soviet montage discussion, does anyone have any comments on like non-Western silence, or I guess like not American or European? Just because I feel like those get overlooked just because of like how many were lost or how few were made. But I think it's like important to acknowledge that they exist.
Right. I mean, during the 20s, Japan is having probably one of the best decades ever for film. But sadly, we just don't have movies from. We have a couple, but not much. And it's again because of the world wars that we just have lost. So
I think
many
I saw
movies
something that like Mizoguchi's like first like 30 films have been lost or something.
That's so sad.
Which is insane. I mean, like Ozu was working in the silent era as well. So.
Yeah.
I think there was also a big earthquake in the 20s that just a lot of films were lost at that point. I think the statistic, at least for Japanese silence, I saw somewhere around 4% have survived. Like that's tragically low. Yeah.
And it's the same in other Asian countries as well, like China and India all had film industries, but we have
close to nothing.
Very few of those, if nothing.
I think with Japan, like besides like the early works of directors that are a little more known for their golden age works, it's mostly like Page of Madness is the one that people watch, which we don't even have in its complete form. And that's another one that I think people get a little confused because it's something that it doesn't have inner titles, so it was meant to be kind of narrated over, but it's still one of those like wildly experimental works that makes you kind of like feel sad for how much has been, what's even been lost of that film, but just like what's been lost from like Japan's early cinema era as a whole.
Yeah, I think Page of Madness, it's a good connection to Soviet Montage. Its rapid editing is really quite strikingly similar, even though I don't know if it was directly influenced or not, or if it just happened to be that way. I know that the director did see F.W. Murnau's The Last Laugh, and that had a very, it influenced the visual style in a way that makes it a little bit reminiscent of German Expressionism.
Yeah, it's really, it's another one of those that's just like wildly experimental and like not very realistic. I can see the German Expressionism connection also of like how kind of like paranoid and like mind focused it is, which is really interesting. I think the only silent I've seen from China is The Goddess. I think that's like one of the only ones. I think there are more, but it's the most famous.
Argentina also is starting to get a serious film industry by the late 20s. South America in general, cinema is coming around at this time period, but also we just don't have a lot.
Actually, speaking of Argentina, the very first animated film from that country, well, just in general, like the very first animated film ever, it was also lost. It came out in 1917. And it only existed for, I think, like 8 years before it was lost in a fire. It's just tragic because that's like the biggest piece of animation history that we're missing right now.
Yeah, that is sad. That's kind of a common thread, though, and something I feel like if you're someone who enjoys silent movies, you have to kind of realize is what we see today is really only because they were popular for the most part. Anything else is just luck or happenstance that we have. Um, it's kind of shocking how much we have lost over time. And even back then, there were efforts to save films, but it really fire was such a big
Yeah.
issue back
we
then.
we probably
It really destroyed
yeah.
so much.
We probably I was just gonna say we really only see what was worth producing lots of copies of and what was probably like the best of the best, and even then there are like really big gaps in
Yeah,
what we
because the
have.
more you got distributed, like the bigger chances you had to survive because there's more copies of you.
Yeah, right. Like Metropolis, I feel like is the classic example of how insane it is to find silent films. Right? It had been that movie isn't really the full movie, but what we have is from different prints from all over the world. So what we have is a mix of different countries' versions of the film we just put together,
We're
which is
only
pretty
missing
amazing.
like 5 minutes or something now,
Yeah,
right? Because we found like 30 minutes of it was found in like an archive in Argentina, I think.
I think in
Um,
Brazil,
that added about half an hour to the film. Yeah, or maybe
in
it
like
was
the early
Brazil,
2000s.
but
Yeah,
like add yeah, yeah, like 100 years after it was made, and like there are still some of those discoveries being made. Um, but yeah, it is really like unfortunate. Like just like these mass losses of film history is really um devastating. Yeah.
But I feel like that's something cool coming out of this. Is like there's definitely we're kind of like in a
Hmm.
golden age right now when it comes to availability of films, and that's been like a big spike in silent film availability and remasters. This is like the highest period of we've had stuff like that
Yeah.
happen.
It's really great that a lot of silents are just available on YouTube, and then also like there's really great restoration work being done. Of course, the films that get restored are the most popular ones and the ones we have the most copies of. Um, but it's like really sometimes it's just like unbelievable how good some of the restorations are because you're used to seeing things in these like deteriorated,
Right.
grainy quality to see really early works just like absolutely flawlessly restored. Yeah.
So I think we should talk about the big elephant in the room with silent films, and its sound in general, and the coming of sound, and what that did to the end of silent films as we know it. Um, it's kind of like a controversial transition from late 20s to early 30s, and silent films are basically gone almost completely, at least from America. And that change was so fast and drastic that it was kind of almost whiplash for movies as an art form. So I think the way to think about the transition is it took a while to happen. It wasn't like, right, so everyone knows about The Jazz Singer, right, which is like not the first sound movie, but it was definitely the biggest sound movie. And to even call it a sound movie is a misnomer. It was more like they had synchronized noises for one scene in that movie. That movie's also incredibly boring, by the way. So I think you could do better for watching another movie with potential different sounds going on. But right, so like I think by 1926, Warner Brothers really pushed out a movie called Don Juan, which is lost, so we don't have it. But it was the first actual full sound film where it was recorded on a disc and played behind the movie the entire time. Uh, and it did pretty well, but after that, they just went harder and harder. Eventually, I think by 1930, most films were going to be having full synchronized sound at that point. Um, what is interesting though is it a lot of the movies in the late 20s and early 30s had sound versions and silent versions. Like All Quiet on the Western Front, right, which is a wonderful war movie, has a sound version and a silent film version because movie theaters just didn't have the sound systems hooked up yet. And it's also why, right, like Russia took so long to in other countries to get out of like the silent film eras because they just didn't have the technology or the money to get sound yet.
Mike, would you like to share your thoughts about the jazz singer?
I know that you have opinions on the early sound era.
So I guess, well, I did watch The Jazz Singer for this episode. It's kind of like Birth of a Nation, a film too big to ignore, kind of. Although,
and it's also racist.
that's the only real comparison I would make. It is a bit racist, yeah, but I would say not
as
mean-spirited like the way Birth of a Nation is. It uses blackface, but not in a way that feels like it's not as bad as it could have been, I guess is how I can say it. It's overall just it's a kind of a mediocre cliched narrative that didn't really work for me, but I can see why it was tremendously impactful for the American public who didn't see anything synchronized sound-wise to that point. And basically, the film is silent in its DNA. There's intertitles. It has a musical score for the most part, but it abruptly transitions to moments where there's like a song or dance number, basically. So there's a bunch of popular songs and some incidental dialogue in addition to the score. And that just captured the audiences and basically enabled and precipitated the downfall of the silent era. I guess this was 1927. I wanted to just name a few other films released in 1927. Some we talked about: Metropolis, Napoleon, Sunrise, October, Wings. The point is, this was basically the peak of the silent era. Silent films had yet, I think, to really decline, and I think auteurs are really hitting their stride and really just experimenting in wildly different ways. And the really sad part about this is it all ended right at the very peak of everyone's abilities and this whole developmental, experimental part of the era.
Yeah, definitely. And what's interesting is by the end of the 20s, America had kind of poached a lot of big European talent. So a lot of the big European directors moved over to America and started working in sound films when they necessarily didn't want to. But they were offered more money and a little more job security over there. So they went. And also, right, World War II is coming. So there's a lot of drama going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think that the way that I feel I have not seen a lot from like the 30s, which is something that I would like to do, but I think that when you watch those late sound or late silent era films, you like really get a sense of like, yeah, when they had hit their peak and when people had kind of figured out the medium and created some of their best works. And it is like a little unfortunate how abruptly it was cut off. And then this, some of like the 30s films that I watched are like early sound films. They just don't feel as like, fluid and like they haven't figured themselves out yet. And I guess that's just like the nature of how things were. And for audiences at the time, I guess they had nothing to compare to. They couldn't compare to like the sound films of today that are, you have to like understand like the wonder of like seeing someone on a screen and hearing their voice. But I don't know. I always kind of like struggle to make myself watch 30s films just because I just don't enjoy them as much. There's just something. There are some great ones. Don't get me wrong. There are like some good ones. I don't know. I just can't make myself get into them so much.
I think it's so the 30s do get a bit of a bad rap. I think they're a little bit unfairly maligned.
Sorry.
I do think the transition period was a little rough, getting to full sound technology, but around 1933 is, I think, when most of it was settled anyways. Yeah. But I think just in general, it's not just the 30s. I think film since the end of the silent era, basically as soon as sound was introduced, there's a shift away from this very surreal visual storytelling. And dramas in particular, and that's just something that really hasn't come back since the silent era. So that's, I think, the biggest tragedy of the silent era ending. And yeah, I mean, the 30s coming right after, it's the easiest to beat up on, but I think that style never came back ever.
I was gonna say it might depend on the sort of things that you value, or like people are attracted to the silent era for certain reasons, and the people who are like very attached to the silent era, it's like the things that they often love are just not so strong in some of those early talkies. And so I don't know, maybe I beat up the 30s too much. I really would like to see more from the 30s, but it is a little hard to make yourself watch stuff that's like the sound quality and whatever. Like there are restorations, but like
I think one noticeable difference for me at least is that from the 30s on, there's like a lot more. There's more of a focus on like recognizable movie stars, in my opinion.
yeah.
Like the types of Cary
nice.
Grant,
Yeah.
Jimmy Stewart, they all got their start in this era. And I feel like the way I got into the 30s, it was more through like watching their movies and getting attached to them as actors. And that made it way easier to like open up myself to this era and like seek more movies out just to watch them in whatever role they might happen to get.
Yeah, I think something to understand about like the transition from silent to sound is honestly censorship. Censorship was a big influence on why the 30s movies are the way they are. I mean, even back in the silent era, censorship was pretty big deal. Like you couldn't show necessarily everything in the UK, and actually in America, this is kind of shocking. So in 1915, the Supreme Court ruled that film censorship, like in the state of Ohio, was totally legal. So it got rid of all First Amendment rights for films. And that ruling wasn't taken away till the 50s. So during that time period, there is a huge censorship on what you can actually show in movies. And right, then you have the Hays Code in America by the 30s that went on till the 60s, right, which determines what again you can actually show on your movie. So that definitely hampers creative spirits. Right, a lot of the 30s and 40s movies are trying to get around the rules as best they can. Right, there's like that little sliver of films in the 30s that are fully sound, very violent, very intense, and then boom, they're gone once the Hays Code kicks in. Right, it changes the landscape of film, at least in America, but the censorship is going around the whole globe at that point too. So that's something I think to keep in mind. It's just like times were changing, and then again on top of all of the censorship, right, is the studio systems are finally full force. There's a lot of money in movies now, and you don't want to waste $25,000 on a bad movie. So there, you got to make sure things are going a certain way on set and story wise. So I think that is just some context to keep in mind from that time period and the transition. It's just there was so much change.
I think for as much change as was going on, there's a lot of great movies that came out in the 30s. Yeah.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, there are like, I would say that a lot of my interest in the 30s is mostly at the moment really early Japan stuff. Just because I think like I'm just really attached to things that are really like visually expressive or like, have like a certain beauty to them. And I've found like a lot of, understated visual beauty in those. And they're a little less like narratively focused and kind of take on some of that like visual expressiveness that I like, even though they're early sound films. So there's a lot of variety in the 30s as well. I don't want to hate on the 30s too much. I've not like fully explored everything that I wanted to from the 30s.
Yeah, that's right.
Keep hating on the 30s, SMH.
You've hated on the 30s before too.
Well, so now that we're talking about more American stuff, we definitely skipped over classic Hollywood silent films and Charlie
Yeah.
Chaplin. I mean, you gotta talk about that. It's too big.
Yeah. No, I was gonna mention that in like my misconceptions about silent films, that I think a lot of even like non-movie people, if they've seen a silent film, it's usually Charlie Chaplin, which I think prompts this
Right.
misconception that like all silent films are like slapstick comedies, which is entirely not true. Like I know some people,
Right, a lot
a
of them
lot of
were.
them were, but like I was talking to my dad about this. It's like he was like saying that really the only silent films he's ever seen were Metropolis and like probably some Charlie Chaplin and like maybe a little bit of Nosferatu, which I think there were a lot of slapstick comedies, but I do think that that's like what a lot of people have seen and what a lot of people associate with the silent era if they're not super familiar with it.
Also, without dialogue, it's hard to get
totally.
any other kind of comedy across.
Yeah.
Definitely, right.
I do really admire the like slapstick craft, like how like there's something kind of enchanting about them. I don't really usually enjoy things that are meant to be super funny, but I just think that they're like kind of like wacky and fun. I always enjoy slapstick comedies more than I think I'm going to.
So yeah, the slapstick comedy is maybe as I think you've said, it's like the biggest genre that came out of this period. Actually, it's interesting. I think most all the major film genres were codified during the 20s. The slapstick comedy, though, this one in particular, so it started in I think in the 1910s by this guy named Max Sennett at Keystone Studios. He made a bunch of shorts, and he used this kind of narrative logic that was basically just kind of thrown away just for fantastic visual humor. And so it was very kind of an anarchic mix of like circus and vaudeville and pantomime and things like that. And he enlisted a bunch of people that you might have heard of, like Charlie Chaplin, Harry Langdon, Roscoe Arbuckle or Fatty Arbuckle, Harold Lloyd. And all these people eventually left Keystone to form their own production companies. But yeah, I guess to segue into maybe Chaplin in particular, who I know some of us really love, who are not named Elaina. Yeah, as I think as a lot of people know, he's the persona of the Little Tramp. He developed this at Keystone, and he made a bunch of these 2 reel shorts, these kind of 20-ish minute shorts with this character, and he kind of became internationally known for this. He was actually one of the, I guess, he might be the first big star, because prior to movies, there's really no other way for people to know, like people who performed in theaters were not known nationally or even internationally. So Chaplin was perhaps the first that was known to everyone around the world. And so, yeah, I guess what are some of your favorite things about Chaplin, or some of your favorite Chaplin films?
Well, I think if I if I go by average director rating, I think he's like my number 1. I've seen 5 movies of his, and not a single one is like below 4 stars. So I think his average is probably like 4.3 or something. But yeah, I can't get enough of his stuff. He's super funny.
What's your favorite so far?
My favorite Chaplin is actually The Great Dictator, which is not a silent. But
you're not allowed to mention that.
Nope, can't say it.
You can't say that.
My favorite of his silents is probably The Gold Rush, I would say. Well, that I've seen. I haven't seen Circus or a couple of the other smaller ones.
The Gold Rush is a little interesting because it had the unlikely inspiration of, I think, the Donner Party, with some of the food jokes in particular. You see like Chaplin cooking and eating his own shoe.
I don't know why. He's just so good with like his expressions and his timing.
I know.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I think the thing that has really, even like today, like I think Chaplin's films are really popular still. And I think part of the reason for that is just he has such a distinctive look as well. Like it's just this like short, like silly, like not super like masculine man, I think is just like it's just really like
You
recognizable.
know what it is?
Which I
He's
think
relatable.
he's relatable.
I see a lot of myself
No.
in him, to be honest.
But they're always like he's always kind of like the butt of the joke
That's
a
what I
little
am.
bit, and like makes fun of himself a bit. And like I think of that scene in I think it's Modern Times where it's like the boxing and it's like making fun of like how just like puny he is. And I'm like, it's just something like about like him just like as a person that's like very funny as well. I think the two I've seen, have I seen two of them? I forget. I've seen Modern Times is like weird because it's like after the silent era, but it's like kind of a silent film, but they allow talking through technology.
Yeah, that's an interesting
Which
mix of the genres.
I think it still counts as a silent film. And I don't know. There's just something I can't really say much beyond that. I think that they're like funny and the jokes are well crafted. But I think that like concept wise they're pretty good too. Like Modern Times has like an underlying commentary, which makes it an interesting piece as well. So
Right, I think the most famous Chaplin movie, at least early on, was The Kid. That was such a big movie when that came out, and it's such a simple film. Like it's just about
And a
a
kid?
dude and a newborn kid
Well,
trying
not
to figure
newborn.
out
He's like 5 years
poverty,
old.
and yeah, he's young and he's looking to Chaplin's character for some kind of father figure, and it's such a nice.
It's like the
It's just a nice
definition of a
experience,
feel-good
and
movie.
it's also well made. Yeah, exactly, and it did so well in the theaters as well. It really kind of threw Chaplin big time that way, because but he'd been making a bunch of shorts before then. That was really the big first one for him. That was I think 1921. I think was when that came out. So after that, he got to spend a lot more money on some of his dream projects, like Modern Times and The Great Dictator,
yeah,
City Lights.
the other one
stuff
I've seen
like
is
that.
City Lights.
One thing I think is one of Chaplin's strengths is he's not only very funny, but he's also like surprisingly good at nailing the emotional core of his movies. Like they're all very sincere,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
even though the characters are like exaggerated, you still like understand them and you sympathize with them to an extent. I think people would be surprised by, if they just see like a silly slapstick comedy,
Yeah,
they wouldn't expect to like
Yeah.
actually relate to
Definitely.
these characters. Like I said,
I always see Chaplin as like a great like American propaganda piece, because he represents like this guy who's down on his luck, but he always figures shit out.
yeah, he became a millionaire in the gold rush.
He's always fine. Right, like he has opportunities always, and can generally get out of
Chaplin
anything
is
that he
the
wants.
American dream.
Yes,
I was gonna also say that like the two that I've seen kind of deal in some way with, well, I think that like their stories really revolve around like poverty and like modern life in the early 20th century, which I think that if you're thinking about films becoming a means of entertainment for a lot of ordinary people, like that's something that those people could like resonate with, or like especially thinking about in big cities where films were being shown a lot and you had like immigrant populations and maybe they didn't like really know the language that well, but you could understand this film and like understand it because there's really no talking, and like these images of the American dream being like translated to you through these films, and like seeing someone who's in poverty and seeing those things work out is like kind of understandable why his films were popular as well, especially considering the silent film audience.
Keep in mind, those two were released during the Depression.
Yeah.
So there was an extra layer of this economic anxiety of the public that I think they turned to Chaplin and this guy down on his luck, and seeing him being able to, through his good-naturedness, being able to turn things around and ultimately get what he wants in the end. I think they found that really quite inspirational, at least for this time.
And it still hits
It's
pretty
an
hard
example of
to this day.
yeah. I think there's an example of like American propaganda that you don't really think about that much. I mean, I don't know how intentionally. Well, was probably intentionally meant as some form of propaganda.
Well, so Chaplin's other counterpart is Buster Keaton, who is definitely seen a resurgence in notoriety and popularity in the last couple decades. But his movies, while also very funny, like Chaplin, they're a little more they're a little different of a vibe from Chaplin. Chaplin has a lot of social commentary and silly jokes with slapping and stuff. And yes, Keaton has that, but a lot of his films are pretty inventive in the gags that he pulls. Um, I mean, in the movie The General, which is probably his most famous movie, he's literally on a train moving that's really moving and it's really there, and he's just knocking wood off the train tracks as the train is moving towards him. So he could die at any point while doing this skit. And it's that kind of level of commitment to the bit that I think is so wonderful about
Yeah, I think The
Buster
General
Keaton.
was, after Nosferatu, the second silent film I ever watched. And I remember being a little underwhelmed back then, but I'm sure if I were to give it a rewatch, like just the sheer scale he displays in all of his stunts, I think would impress me a lot more.
Yeah, I think rewatching is definitely. I was similarly like not incredibly impressed the first Keatons I saw, but I rewatched Sherlock Jr. I think not too long ago, and that really just kind of floored me with some of the things he was able to do with how he the projection room scene in particular, the one where he actually jumps in.
Yes.
It's stunning.
Yeah.
Still now.
Yeah, I think you go to Chaplin for like heart and pure comedy. You go to Keaton for like creativity and the stunts that he pulls.
I'm curious. I want to do a quick straw poll around the room. Chaplin or Keaton?
Chaplin.
I've only seen Sherlock Jr., so I don't
Gotta pick one.
I don't think I can say it. I've seen like 2 Chaplin and 1 Keaton, so
I think I'm gonna have to say Chaplin.
Damn, I thought you would say Keaton, Geoff.
Oh, wow.
I love Keaton, but Chaplin made The Great Dictator, and that movie is just so incredible.
Well, we can't talk about it now.
I know.
It's hard for me to judge because Sherlock Jr. is only like 45 minutes. But I do like that Chaplin has like a strong narrative behind his like comedic works, which makes me enjoy them.
Well, I think you would like The General, because that's definitely
that probably had I need to see something a little longer from Keaton to like really judge. But I do remember enjoying like I think I really enjoyed Sherlock Jr. as well.
I've seen like 5 Chaplin and 2 Keaton, so it's not really a fair comparison. But I think I respect Keaton a lot more now than I used to.
Yeah, I guess for my own answer, when I was starting out, I'd say hands down Chaplin. Right now, it's a lot closer. Yeah. I think I'd still lean Chaplin a little bit, but he has that kind of nostalgic edge for me. City Lights and The Great Dictator.
We've forgotten someone, guys. What about Harold Lloyd?
Yep. That's right. We got to talk about Harold Lloyd now. The third, even more obscure character. There's so many back then.
We're just going to go down the list, all of them.
Right. I think the one that everyone knows from him is Safety Last.
I think that's the only one I've seen.
Yeah, it is a great,
I've not seen any.
Hysterical picture. It's really so funny. I haven't seen nearly enough of his work to necessarily have a hard opinion on him. But again, he's so creative with his visual gags in his movies. I've seen, I think, Safety Last, The Freshman, and Girl Shy, I believe. And all of them, I don't... So from those 3, narratively, they're not really that interesting. But the gags are fantastic. They are top-notch, hysterical, physical comedy with a lot of setup and a lot of payoff. So definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, I've only seen a couple Harold Lloyds, and one was Safety Last, which has a really iconic skyscraper, or I guess, of just a building climbing section, which, you know, I think it's still pretty remarkable seeing him scale, all with, you know, effects and stuff, and using forced perspective, things like that, to make it look like he's actually climbing a building. But he, you know, it's still really well done. I've seen also his film The Freshman, which is him as this like fish out of water college kid who's gets pulled into the football team and has to play football.
And he's just terrible.
You know, it's charming.
He's just awful at it, but it's great to watch.
Yeah, it's a fun, silly time. It's nothing deeper. I think, as to me, he's always, I think, gonna just because he's next to Chaplin and Keaton. He always, his reputation.
Two of the greatest movie stars ever.
But
and then the final fourth secret one that we don't hear a lot about either is Fatty Arbuckle. He's kind of the grandfather, to be honest, of all of these guys. He started Chaplin's career. He helped Buster Keaton out. So he's kind of the big man on stage, but he has a very complicated history. And it's mostly because he was convicted of rape, I believe, in the 1920s, and that kind of ruined him as an actor, as it should have. So after that, he was pretty much done.
Well, he wasn't actually convicted, but it did ruin his career. So I guess the scandal was he was accused of raping and murdering this woman at a party, which was basically, I guess, shown by the media as this drunken orgy. And this was like the Prohibition era, so this was very scandalous. So yeah, basically the public completely turned against him, and movies in general. They were seen as like this, you know, disturbing, you know, not moral part of society. And this actually kind of led to the Hays Code in some ways.
He was like the first big drama.
So yeah, it was a huge scandal. Yeah. And it kind of overshadowed everything else he did, like his body of work. I personally don't think I've seen any Fatty Arbuckle films.
I've seen a couple of short comedies, and again, he's like a Chaplin, to be honest. He's just physical comedy, and he's a big man, so you're laughing at a lot of fat jokes and him falling down on things, which again, it can be funny, but
precursor to Melissa McCarthy.
There you go.
Yeah, I know his name. I've heard of it, but I've never seen any of his stuff.
Yeah, he has a tainted history, so he's usually not in the conversation for very long, if he is at all.
Yeah. American Silence are just like something that I need to see a bit more of. I don't know if there are any American Silence that are outside of the slapstick thing that we want to talk about, or directors.
I think there's one. I know we're going long.
Yeah,
but,
it's okay.
Stroheim,
yes,
I think,
definitely
would be the big one to talk about. There are other ones like Cecil B. DeMille, who I think was a lot more important then, but is really, a much more obscure figure nowadays. There's Robert Flaherty, documentarian, known for Nanuka the North, especially. Controversial sort of doc, where he kind of staged some of the elements, but it was one of the first actual like documentaries done on location. But I guess Stroheim in particular, I think, has made at least one really a great film called Greed.
The movie's incredible.
Still not seen that. But...
Yeah, it has a interesting kind of history.
Oh, is that the one with the? Never mind. I'll let you talk about it. Sorry. I was gonna say we're part of it's lost.
A lot of it is.
No. Well, I mean, yes, but in a different way. So, this was a film. His original version was 10 hours. So, basically, he had to cut half the footage, but it was still too damn long for the studio. So they had to even cut it down to 4 hours, which was the cut he was signing off on. But basically, his studio, which was Goldwyn Pictures at the time, they merged with Metro and Mayer Pictures to become MGM. They took the film from Stroheim and they cut it down even in half, that 4 hour version, to 2, and they destroyed the film they cut. So the parts that they cut were destroyed, and never could be recovered, unfortunately. So we're kind of left with this 2-hour version with ideas of what the full version could have been like, but it has a lot of gaps in continuity, but it's still a work of like very rich psychological characterization.
Which is the one where part of it's been lost, but we have stills
It
that tell the story.
Green still that does that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's a version by TCM that they replaced all these missing scenes that they had stills of. They just showed it kind of like a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Which, to my mind at least, it breaks the flow of the
it
film.
Definitely does.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
It's not a recommended first watch. I think it's good if you've already seen the film in the incomplete version than the quote unquote this more restored version.
In the United States, I was just gonna say that a lot of the like directors that were working in the silent era were like directors who came after kind of establishing their careers in Europe as well, or at least a few of them.
Yeah.
So
America poached a lot of people. Quite a lot.
Yes, Stroheim originally from Vienna.
Yeah.
And he immigrated. Yeah.
Yeah, and Stroheim worked with Griffin on Intolerance.
Intolerance.
Yes. And Birth
and Hearts of the World. Yeah.
So he's definitely got a foot there.
But he was definitely someone who the studios really didn't like because he went like super long and over budget with some of his projects. Again, his career kind of spiraled downward after Greed.
Oof.
Eventually, he had films that he was removed from. They couldn't get off the ground, and he ended his career kind of just writing screenplays.
I think everyone knows him best from Sunset Boulevard. Would probably be the most recognizable thing for him.
Yes.
He shows up in them.
Yeah, and I think this could be a good segue to talk about maybe the larger legacy of silent films, unless there's any other last thoughts on American silence.
No, I think we're ready.
I think that's mostly it, yeah.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so I guess I had a little list of films that were kind of more modern, or films made after the silent era that were direct homages or references to the silent era in some way. And one was Sunset Boulevard, which Geoff mentioned, which took place at this. Well, it uses a former silent era star in Gloria Swanson to basically almost portray herself in her current status as this washed up star, and really, just a excellent movie about this whole, this contrast between the two eras, this whole struggling to adjust after the silent era. A lot of these stars and directors, people that just could not adapt at all, and their careers fizzled out in some way. The other film around this time, which took place at this transition point, was Singing in the Rain, which I think everyone knows, and one of the beloved films. But it shows how awkward these early silent or early sound films were, trying to put mics on people and trying to get them to say things into the microphone and whatnot. So it's really, two just really wonderful films. So I could keep going down the list here. There have been some filmmakers we know, like Jacques Tati, who made Monsieur Hulot's Holiday, one of Elaina's favorite films.
God. Sorry I think Iggy's the Tati enjoyer here.
Yeah, okay, Iggy. Yeah, it was a joke.
I know.
But, yeah, it's homage to silent comedies, I believe, although I haven't seen it.
He's very much
just
I think
influenced
that's
by Chaplin.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comparison because it's a later. I've seen like 3 of his films for no reason, but I was gonna say it's like a later example of like physical comedy, or kind of this like situational comedy where there's like not a lot of speaking, but it's very funny. I think even like Playtime, you could say that about, because it's like Playtime is.
I think
it's really hard to describe if you've never seen.
With Tati, it's less physical, and it's more like, I don't know if psychological is the term, but it's more dealing with like the absurdities of everyday life.
Yeah, it's about like the absurdity. I think that like Playtime, especially, I would say, is like about the absurdity of like modern life and technology, which is like something that like I can see the Chaplin comparison because that's something that Chaplin um goes into as well, and it's not like, you know,
It's like the modern
like
times of
it's
his
not
era.
so, yeah,
Yep.
it's not like so overtly funny, at least to me, as like some of those silent era comedies, but they have like this, there is kind of like a just like, yeah, just comedy of like the absurdity of things that you can express without words.
I think Tati is a really good example of like if silent films weren't like snuffed out so early, and if they were allowed to
Mhm.
continue to evolve. I think Tati is pretty much what they would have led to, because it's his ability to like pack in jokes with such density. It's like incredible. I think Chaplin would have really been proud.
Yeah, there's a like, I think a subtlety of humor, um like a subtlety of that kind of humor in his work. Unfortunately, that doesn't really like, I've already said this, that I'm not a huge fan, but I understand the appeal, and I understand that like connection. I think is really fascinating. um his films are just like, they're very like French humor. They're so French. um
Anyway, we'll get to
but
Tati
that's,
next
yeah,
time.
you'll do another episode.
There you
A
go.
different
Different
episode.
I
episode.
think.
Yeah, I'll just go through some of these other
Mhm.
ones, but I mean, just broadly, Orson Welles made a silent comedy homage, Too Much Johnson, in 1938. Mel Brooks did the silent movie called The Silent Movie in 1976 or something like that. I don't know if it's actually silent, but it's called The Silent Movie. Ho Xiaoshen made Three Times, which has a middle segment which is all silent and using intertitles. Guy Madden, this avant-garde documentarian slash, I don't know the types of films he makes, categorize them exactly, but some of his were silent film homages. Aki Kaurismäki made one called Juha in 1999, uh, black and white with intertitles. And I guess some that are like Werner Herzog, who made Nosferatu in '79, which is, I guess you could say, a remake of the Murnau film. Uh, it really, I think, goes back to that film and some of the source material, but uh, it evokes it in ways that I think you can call it a direct, in the direct line of. And lastly, I guess the one that a lot of people know, maybe the only silent film a lot of people have seen, is The Artist, the recent Best Picture winner from 2011. And yeah, quite a controversial film in some ways, or not a particularly good one from what I hear, but at least shows that the people are still very much inspired by the silent
Definitely.
era. There have been
Mhm.
films made around the world, and even to this day, that they still captures people's imaginations in a lot of ways. So I don't know if anyone had thoughts on any of these
Yeah.
films or.
I've seen Juha and The Artist, and I don't really particularly care for either of them. I would just say that I hate to say that like films outside of the silent films outside the silent era just like don't have the same charm. They feel like a gimmick to me. Like Juha is really like, it's really, I don't know. It's just kind of dull and boring. There's really like nothing, no reason for it to be the way it is, in my opinion. Um, and The Artist, I've heard people who like it say that it's like, it's one of those movies about like love of cinema that some people resonate with, but it just feels like it rips off a lot of like the silent era originals in some way. And it's like, just watch the silent era ones. I don't know why we need this like rehashing of things that people did 100 years ago. Um, so I just kind of don't. It again just kind of feels like a gimmick to me. I would rather watch things that are kind of a reinvention of like silent era techniques maybe, but not done through such overt means. I think the Tati comparison is really interesting, but there are like a lot of other very like wordless films out there that like even ones you didn't really mention. Like I think that it's just interesting to think of like storytelling with minimal words and how people do that now in ways that are kind of like less overt references to the silent era, or not even like really conscious references to the silent era, but just like different ways of uh, like storytelling without dialogue.
Right. So for me, a lot of the silence influence is on directors that you probably know, like today. So like in The Shining, the very famous scene where he's chucking his axe through the door, right, is heavily inspired by the film Broken Blossoms. There's a scene in there where Lillian Gish is hiding in a room, and the person trying to get in there is hacking away at the door with an axe, and it's filmed very similar way, almost identical. And I know for a fact that Kubrick watched that scene before filming it as like a reference point. Um, there's the famous Odessa steps. Right, you see that in films all the time. Like that scene is referenced quite a lot in modern films, but I think like the most famous representation of that scene is definitely in Brian De Palma's film. And it's a direct reference, almost shot for shot, to that scene.
Yep.
Yes,
The Untouchables.
The Untouchables. So there's a lot of like little things like that come from the silent era that maybe you just don't know or don't realize. Right, a lot of the silent era is just established movie making terms, and physical act of filming comes from that. So we take a lot of it for granted, I would say. Just in how we watch movies now, a lot of it is being created and born during this time period, and it's fun to watch an art form so brand new and so modern in the scheme of our human history, right? And we get to watch a lot of it just evolve in a lot of different ways, and that's fascinating. I love that about silence. All right, so now that you've heard us talk all about silence and how we feel about them, our next episode is going to be very specific films that all of us really like, and we're going to talk about those in the next episode. So be on the watch out for that.
Subscribe and keep your eye out.
Exactly.
Smash that like button.
Thank you for listening.
Hit the bell.
Hit the bell to be notified.